Posting order said supply liaison, 6-week transit, Varessi cargo hauler, Orath Vane, departure 0430 Mara Standard. Said nothing about quarters, nothing about diet accommodations, and nothing about pets. Put Holt's paperwork in the same folder as mine and decided that was close enough. He was 4 years old, a yellow Labrador with a broad skull and a permanently wet nose, and he had been on 2 supply runs before this one without incident. First had been a 3-week loop on a Terran freighter where the crew already knew what a dog was. The second had been a 10-day jump on a mixed Cerveni transport where the crew had not known what a dog was, but had been too politely curious to say anything alarming. Holt had eaten, slept, walked the corridor twice daily, and returned home. He had not bitten anyone. He had not growled at anyone. He had, on the 3rd day, sat on the Cerveni first mate's foot for 40 minutes while she processed cargo manifests, and she had eventually stopped trying to move him and just worked around him, which I chose to interpret as a successful diplomatic outcome. The Orath Vane was different in one specific way that I did not fully appreciate at the time. The Varessi kept records of everything. I do not mean this loosely. I mean the Varessi as a species had evolved in an environment where not knowing what the large thing in your vicinity was doing had historically resulted in being eaten. And they had addressed this survival problem by writing things down. Their ships ran on 12 simultaneous operational logs. Their cargo manifests had sub-manifests. Their crew rotations were documented in triplicate before they happened, once while they happened, and once again afterward, to confirm that what had been documented had in fact occurred. I learned all of this from the orientation packet Veth Oren gave me when I came aboard, packet which was itself 47 pages long, and included a section titled Standard Observational Protocols for Non-Varessi Crew Attachments, which I read on the first evening, and found thorough, professional, and faintly ominous in a way I couldn't immediately name. Veth Oren was the senior cargo officer. He was Varessi in the standard configuration, about 2 meters tall, bilaterally symmetrical, 4 upper limbs of varying size and function, gray-green scaling that shifted to a dull amber under artificial light, 3 horizontal pupils in each eye that could focus independently or in concert. He had been doing this run for 11 years. He ran a tight ship, by which I mean he ran a tightly documented ship, which for a Varessi was the same thing. He met me at the ramp with a datapad. Cadet Roft, he said. His translator rendered his speech in flat, precise standard. Welcome to the Orath Vane. I have your quarters assignment, your duty rotation, and a few preliminary questions regarding the animal. His name is Holt, I said. Oran looked at Holt. Holt looked back at Oran, with the specific expression of a Labrador who has recently detected something edible in a room, and is conducting a calm, initial survey to determine its exact location. His tail moved in a slow, measured arc. It was not aggressive, it was not submissive, it was, as far as Holt was concerned, simply the appropriate speed for a tail when a new and potentially interesting thing was being evaluated. Fran wrote something on the datapad. Holt, he repeated. Breed designation? Labrador Retriever. Earth domestic. No special handling required. He wrote that down too. The preliminary questions, he said, can wait until after your gear is stowed. I have scheduled 30 minutes for the initial intake assessment. I had not known there would be an initial intake assessment. I said this. There is always an initial intake assessment, Oran said, for non-Varessi crew attachments. Standard protocol. I looked at the datapad. I looked at Holt, who had given up on the silent survey and was now sitting squarely on the ramp, watching Oran with the patient attention of a dog that has not been fed since Euro 600. And is acutely aware that time is passing. Does the protocol cover dogs? I asked. It covers biological organisms, Oran said. We will adapt as needed. That was the first sign, and I did not read it correctly. The intake assessment took 42 minutes, not 30, because Oran had follow-up questions about each answer. What did Holt eat? How often? At what temperature? What was the function of the leash? What was the function of the collar? Why did the collar have a metal disc attached to it? What information was on the disc? Was the significance of the name being inscribed on the disc? Was it a rank insignia, a unit designation, a territorial marker? I explained that it was a name tag, for identification if he got lost. Oran wrote this down with the expression of a person writing down something that raised more questions than it answered, but who was too professional to say so in the first meeting. Holt spent the 42 minutes sitting between us, occasionally glancing at the door, occasionally glancing at Oran, and once putting his chin briefly on Oran's lower left limb, with the casual intimacy of a dog who has decided that a new person is acceptable and wishes to communicate this without ceremony. Oran went still for a moment. Then he wrote something on the data pad. I did not ask what. We got underway at 0430 as scheduled. I found my quarters, stowed my gear, set Holt's bowl on the floor beside my bunk, and went to sleep. At 0600 I fed him. I did not think anything of this. I had fed Holt at 0600 every day for 4 years. I measured the kibble into the bowl, 1 cup and 3/4, plus the joint supplement mixed in because he was getting to the age where the vet had opinions about cartilage, set the bowl down, said, okay, and he ate. This took approximately 4 minutes. He ate with the methodical focus of a dog who understood that this meal was not the last meal, but who saw no reason to eat slowly on that account. When he was done, he licked the bowl twice and looked at me for confirmation that there was not more. I told him there was not more. He accepted this and went back to his sleeping spot and lay down with his head on his paws. I did not know that Veth Oran was in the corridor. He was not in the corridor on the first morning. He told me later, when I asked, that he had noticed the door was not fully latched and had paused to ensure it was secured before continuing his morning rounds. He had paused, he said. For approximately 6 minutes, I found out about this on day 12. Day 1 through 4 were unremarkable in the sense that nothing happened that I understood to be remarkable. I ran my duty rotation, assessed cargo manifests, attended the Eero 800 crew briefing, walked Holt in the cargo hold at 1000, and again at 1700, threw his rubber ball down bay 7s approximately 18 times per walk. The bay was long enough that this was a reasonable corridor for a fetch sequence. I had measured it on day 2. The Varessi crew watched the walking. They were not subtle about it. Varessi did not have a strong tradition of pretending not to observe. Observation was, after all, the species' primary survival mechanism, and pretending you were not observing something was, in their framework, both dishonest and dangerous. So they watched from the catwalks, and from the side hatches, and from the junction at the far end of Bay 7, and when Holt returned the ball, they wrote things down or entered data into their pads. And when I threw the ball again, they watched again. On day 3, one of the junior cargo handlers, a young Varessi named Dinek, whose scaling was still the pale gray-green of someone in their first posting, stationed herself at the Bay 7 junction and watched the entire walk without moving. When I finished and turned to go back to the main corridor, she held out the ball which Holt had dropped at her feet on the last return. I said, "You can throw it if you want." She threw it. Her upper limbs were configured differently than mine, and the throw went sideways and hit the bulkhead. Holt retrieved it without complaint and brought it back to her, and dropped it again and looked at her with the patient, encouraging expression of a Labrador who understands that not everyone is good at this on the first try, but believes in the fundamental capacity for improvement. She threw it again. It went straighter. Holt retrieved it. On day 4, she was there again. She had practiced the throwing motion. I could tell because the ball went true on the first attempt, and she had the expression of someone who had done a thing correctly and found. I did not ask what she had written down. I assumed it was cargo-related. Day 5 was when Oran came to the cargo hold during the morning walk. He stood at the Bay 7 junction, where Dinek usually stood and watched me, through the fetch sequence. Holt noticed him and altered his return route to pass close enough to be briefly touched on the head, which Holt found acceptable and Oran found. I watched his face, surprising in a way that was not bad. His upper hand rested on Holt's skull for a moment before Holt moved on to drop the ball at my feet and look at me with the expectation that I would throw it again. I threw it. The retrieval behavior, Oran said. It is voluntary? Completely. He returns the object because he wants to. Yes. What does he get in exchange for returning it? I looked at him. He gets to chase it again. Oran was quiet for a moment. Turn is the cost of the next to throw, he said finally. The transaction is implicit. I suppose that's one way to frame it. He watched Holt retrieve the ball and return it and drop it and look at me. He is not retrieving the object for you, Oran said slowly. He is retrieving it in order to create the conditions for another retrieval. That's probably more accurate, yeah. Oran wrote something down. That evening, after the 1700 walk, I sat on my bunk and ran the grooming brush through Holt's coat. This was a daily procedure. Labrador's shed, and a 6-week transit on a Varessi cargo hauler was not the place to let the shedding go unmanaged. The brush was a basic rubber curry comb for pulling loose fur and moving the oils through. Holt lay on his side and endured this with the expression of a dog experiencing something. That was not quite pleasure, but was certainly acceptable. His eyes half closed, his breathing slowed down. I was 3 minutes into this when I became aware that the door was open. Oran was in the corridor. He had the data pad. He was still, I said. You can come in. He came in, which surprised me. He stood at a professional distance and watched me brush Holt. After about 30 seconds, he said, "What is the function of this procedure?" I explained the function. Coat health, shedding management, skin stimulation, oil distribution, the standard list. And he is calm during it, Oran said. Generally, yes. He was moving at a higher arousal level during the retrieval exercise. Oran said, this brings him down. I suppose so. I've never thought about it that way. The arousal cycle, Oran said. He wrote something down. The morning feeding, the retrieval exercise, the grooming cycle. These are sequential. I do them in roughly the same order every day, yeah. And the feeding is first. Always he eats at 600s, walk at 1000, brush in the evening. Oran wrote this down. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Cadet Roft, may I ask? Why 600? I looked at him, that's just when I get up. He wrote this down too. I went to sleep that night without any particular sense that anything unusual had happened. The Varessi were observational. I had known this from the orientation packet. They were watching the dog, which was reasonable, because the dog was unusual in their context. They were documenting, because that was what they did. This seemed like background noise. On day 9, Veth Oran asked me if I could tell him, in advance, what time I planned to feed Holt the following morning. I said 0600. He said, and if there were a deviation, if the feeding were to occur at 0622, for instance, would the animal's response be different? I thought about this. He'd be aware that it was late, I said. He wouldn't do anything about it. He'd just sit near the bowl and look at me. He would communicate the deviation through posture and proximity. Basically, yeah. Oran wrote this down. He thanked me and continued his rounds. On day 11, I arrived at the mess at 0600 and found that the corner where I usually sat to prepare Holt's bowl had been cleared. The table had been wiped. The standard crew clutter, datapads, tool pouches, the small plastic containers the Varessi used for their morning stimulant drinks, had been moved to the other tables. The corner was clean. I set Holt's bowl down and measured the kibble, and he ate, and I thought, someone cleaned the corner. On day 12, I asked Oran about the corner. He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone who didn't know the answer, but the silence of someone deciding how to frame it. He said, it was flagged in the protocol log as a preparation space for the morning feeding ritual. The crew preferred to keep it clear. I said, the morning feeding ritual. He said, the first offering, yes. I said, you named it. He said, we name everything. I stood there for a moment. Then I said, Veth Oran, what else have you named? He considered this. He turned the datapad so I could see the screen. The file he had opened was titled Provisional Nomenclature, Companion Protocols, and it had 14 entries. I read the first 6. The feeding was the first offering. The bowl was the offering vessel. The kibble, when this is where I had to pause, the sacred substrate. The walk was the circuit of assessment. The ball was the fetch instrument. The throw was the fetch protocol. I said, sacred substrate. He said, the first 2 words are ceremonial designation. It indicates the item has foundational significance in the ritual sequence. The actual substrate is, you noted it contains a joint supplement. We are aware the formulation changes slightly, depending on what the vet prescribes. I said, you know about the joint supplement? Denek asked you about in day 6. I didn't remember day 6 specifically. I said, what else is in this file? There were 14 entries. The circuit of assessment was the walk. specifically the walk as an act of environmental appraisal because Oren had observed that Holt's behavior during the walk was categorically different from his behavior in the quarters, and had theorized that the walk served the function of recalibrating Holt's threat model of the local environment. This was more or less correct. The fetch protocol was documented in detail, including the throw retrieval cycle count. 18 repetitions was standard cycle, below 12 was abbreviated cycle, above 22 was extended cycle, post-arousal surplus. The grooming had been named the brushing doctrine. And I want to be precise here, it was not called the brushing or the grooming procedure, it was called a doctrine, because Oren had concluded after 6 days of observation that it was not simply a maintenance procedure but a behavioral, governance protocol with downstream effects on arousal and threat response calibration. I read the whole list twice. Then I said, "How long have you been working on this?" The provisional nomenclature file was opened on day 3, Oren said. The working group was formalized on day 7. I said, "There's a working group." 4 members, he said. Denik, myself, second engineer Oriv, and our medical officer Sath, who has an interest in behavioral biology. I said, "Your medical officer is on the working group. Proposed the arousal cycle framework," Oren said. We found it clarifying. Holt, who had been sitting beside me during this conversation with the settled patience of a dog attending a meeting that did not concern him, stood up to Oren and sat on his foot. Oren looked down. "This is the foot posture," he said. "We classified it on day 8. It indicates low threat assessment combined with proximity preference. He has done this to 4 crew members, tracking which crew members he has done it to." I looked at Holt. Holt looked at me with the mild expression of a dog that had no particular investment in how this conversation went. I said, "Veth Oron, are you writing a doctrine about my dog?" He said, "We are writing a doctrine about companion species behavior in transit environments, using Holt as the primary observational subject. The working title is Observations on the Companion Animal Protocol. First passage of the Orith vein," I said. "A working title," he said. "The final title has not been determined." I went back to my quarters and sat on my bunk. Holt followed me and put his head in my lap, which he did when he sensed I was processing something. He did not know what I was processing. He did not need to. He was warm and heavy, and he smelled like the cargo hold and slightly like whatever Denik had been eating when she threw the ball that morning. I scratched his ears and thought about it. The thing was, and I kept coming back to this, nothing about it was wrong. They were watching. They were documenting. They were naming things in the way that Varessis named things, which was thoroughly, and with the solemn gravity they brought to all classification work. The names were strange in the way that all Varessi professional nomenclature was strange, was to say formal and slightly ceremonial, and organized around concepts like ritual sequence and threat model calibration, in a way that made basic dog ownership sound like a strategic protocol. But they weren't wrong. The morning feed did come first. The walk was partly about Holt reassessing his environment. Any dog owner who has watched their dog systematically sniff the perimeter of a new space knows that this is what's happening. The grooming did bring his arousal level down. Oran had been watching carefully enough to see the things I'd stopped seeing, because I'd done them every day for 4 years. I scratched Holt's ears and he closed his eyes, and I thought, they're not wrong, they're just taking it very seriously. On day 13, Sath came to find me. Sath was the Orithven's medical officer, and she was a different subspecies of Varessi than Oran and Denek, with lighter scaling, and a slightly different arrangement of upper limbs that was, she explained when I asked, adapted for fine motor precision work. She was precise in the way Oren was thorough. Where he documented everything, she understood the mechanisms. She had read Oren's file. She had been present for 3 of the walks without my noticing. She had a question. "The retrieval exercise," she said. "Holt returns the fetch instrument. He drops it at your feet. You pick it up and you throw it again. This cycle continues for approximately 18 repetitions on standard days. At the end of the sequence, you say a word. I have recorded it as okay, that's enough," and Holt stops retrieving while saw beside you, I said. "Yes. He does not negotiate," Sath said. "He accepts the termination. Generally. He may circle once and look at the instrument, she said. He does not persist. He pushes sometimes. When he's got a lot of energy. She wrote something down. The key variable, she said, is your tone, I said, probably. We ran an analysis on the audio recordings of the termination cues of across 9 sessions, she said. I said, you recorded the sessions, she said. The Orith vein records all activity in the cargo bays for safety documentation. We reviewed the relevant segments. A pause. With your implied consent, we inferred from your general familiarity with our documentation protocols as outlined in the orientation packet. I thought about the orientation packet. The section on standard observational protocols for non-Varessi crew attachments. I thought about the word observational and the range of things it might cover, I said. Okay, she said. The analysis found that the termination cue tone was the primary signal. The specific words were secondary. On day 4, you used okay, done, and on day 6 you used come on, let's go, and on day 9 you used only okay. The responses were equivalent, the tone was consistent. I said, he's reading the tone. He is reading 17 proximate signals simultaneously, she said, of which your tone is the highest weight indicator, but not the only one. Posture changes at termination. Your shoulder drops approximately 6 degrees. Your grip on the instrument changes before you say the cue, which he observes. Your rate of movement toward the bay exit increases by a small but measurable amount in the 3 to 5 throw window before termination. I looked at her. She said, he knows the session is ending before you announce it. The verbal cue confirms what he has already predicted, I said. How long did it take you to figure that out? She said. The working group had the framework by day 10. The audio analysis was completed on day 12. On day 15, I found Denek in Bay 7 waiting with the ball before I arrived for the morning walk. She had started doing this without being asked, arriving early, ball in hand, so that when Holt came through the door, he found both the ball and a person ready to throw it. She had gotten good at the throw. Upper limb mechanics were still different from mine. But she had worked out the release point and the follow-through, and on a standard morning, she could run the full 18 repetitions without the ball hitting the bulkhead. Holt treated her and me as equivalent for ball-throwing purposes. This was, I thought, the highest compliment he could give. I asked her what she was documenting. She showed me her section of the shared file. She was tracking the retrieval arc, the exact path Holt took to the ball, the speed of the return, the point at which he shifted from chase drive to return drive, the way the return speed changed depending on who was at the end of it. She had charts. She had a color-coded map of Bay 7 with Holt's path on each of the first 14 days overlaid. I said, have you always been interested in animal behavior? She said, I am interested in system behavior. Holt is a system. She looked at the charts. Very consistent system, I said. He's also just a dog. She tilted her head. Yes, she said. That is the interesting part. On day 17, Second Engineer Orav found me in the main corridor during my off-rotation hours and asked if he could join the evening brush. I said he could. He sat on the floor of my quarters. The floor, not a seat, because the Varessi had a slightly different relationship with vertical space than humans did. And floor levels was, for many of them, a naturally comfortable position, and watched me run the brush through Holt's coat. After a few minutes, he asked if he could try. I handed him the brush. He was careful about it, initially more careful than was necessary, and then he found the motion. And Holt leaned into it with the same half-closed eyes and a slowed breathing. Orav said, he leans into the pressure. He likes it. The pressure against his side, he moves toward it rather than away. Yeah, most dogs do. He brushed for another minute, sighed. The long, settling exhalation of a dog whose body has decided the day is done and has begun the formal process of becoming extremely heavy and difficult to move. Orav stopped. He looked at me. I said, that means he's comfortable. He resumed brushing, more slowly this time, and Holt sighed again at the different pressure point. And Orav made a small sound that I couldn't classify. Not alarmed, not amused, something quieter than either. He said, the exhalation is involuntary. Basically, he's not doing it on purpose. It just happens when he relaxes. He cannot control it. Not really, no. Orav seemed to find this interesting. He kept brushing. After another minute, he said, when I first came aboard the Orith Ven, I could not sleep for the first 12 nights. The transit noise, the recycled air, the sense of, he stopped, being away from the ground. I grew up on a surface settlement. I am still not fully calibrated to deep transit, I said. That's a long time to not sleep. I functioned, he said, but I was not well. He looked at Holt. I have been sleeping better since day 9. Didn't immediately make the connection. Then I did. I said, day 9 is when you started coming to the cargo hold. Day 9, he said, is when I heard the brush from the corridor and opened the door to see what the sound was. He handed me the brush back and then said, think I have told anyone that. I said I wouldn't repeat it, he said quietly. On my homeworld there was an animal, a large one, would come close to the settlements in the cold season. We were afraid of it. The young ones, the small ones, they would sometimes come to us. They would sit near the fires. We didn't know if they were hunting us or sheltering near us. I said, what did you do? We were still, he said. We tried not to look like prey. He was quiet for a moment. I think they were just cold. He handed me the brush back. Holt had fallen fully asleep. On day 21, which was the 3-week mark, and called a crew meeting, and I was not invited, which I assumed was routine. He told me afterward, when I asked how it went, that the working group had presented their preliminary findings to the full crew. He described this as a sharing session. He said the response had been engaged. I said, what were the findings? He said primarily behavioral. The arousal cycle framework, termination cue analysis from SATH, Dennick's retrieval path documentation, Orov's observations on the brushing response. He paused. And my own section on the feeding ritual. I said, what's in your section on the feeding ritual? He said the sequence, the timing, the measurement, the supplement protocol, the bowl placement. You always place it at the same point relative to your bunk, which we have measured to be 63 centimeters from the starboard wall and 12 centimeters from the bunk edge. The post-feeding bowl acknowledgement. He licks the bowl twice regardless of whether there is residue. Post-feeding return to his sleeping position and the head-on pause posture. I said, you measured where I put the bowl. He said, 63 centimeters from the starboard wall. I said, Oran, why 63 centimeters? He said, we have 2 hypotheses. The first is that it is an ergonomic choice, that 63 centimeters places the bowl in your comfortable reach range while seated on the bunk. The second is that 63 centimeters places the bowl in Holt's comfortable eating position, given his shoulder height and neck angle. He paused. We leaned toward the second, I said. It's probably both. He wrote that down. He also told me at the end of this conversation that 3 additional crew members had requested observer status on the working group after the sharing session. He said the Orathan had a crew of 11, and that 7 of them were now formally involved in some capacity in the documentation effort, which left 4 who were not. I asked what the remaining 4 were doing. He said they were the helm rotation and the load bay operators, and then that shift schedule did not align with the primary observation windows. That 2 of them had begun timing their corridor walks to coincide with Holt's morning circuit. I said, they're scheduling their breaks around the dog walk. He said, I believe they find the overlap useful. I said, useful how? He considered this. Rev, he said, noted in his observational log that Holt's behavior during the morning circuit is characteristically distinct from his behavior at other times. His scan rate is higher. He moves more deliberately. He is, Orev's word, purposeful. He paused. The helm operators have noted that their alertness levels during the overlap window are higher than at other points in their rest break. They have not connected these observations. I have. I said, Holt goes out to work and they feel like they're working too, he said. Sure. They feel as though the environment is being properly assessed and that their own assessment is contributing to an ongoing collective evaluation. Another pause. I may be overstating the mechanism. The data does not yet support that level of claim. I said, but that's the hypothesis. He said, that is the hypothesis. On day 24, Holt got into Orev's tool pouch. This was not a serious incident. The tool pouch had been left open on the floor near the engine access panel, and Holt had investigated it with the thoroughness that Labradors bring to any unsecured container, and he had removed one item. A calibration tool with a rubber grip that was apparently the correct size and texture to be of interest, and carried approximately 8 meters before I caught up with him and asked him to leave it. He left it. Orev, when informed, did not express distress. He expressed interest. He asked whether the rubber grip material was significant. I said I didn't know, possibly. He noted the grip material and the size in his section of the file under a new entry labeled Object Assessment Protocol, non-fetch variant. He also asked, because he was thorough, whether Holt had damaged the tool. The tool was undamaged. It had been carried, not chewed. Rev wrote this down. I explained that Labradors had been bred, in part, to carry objects without damaging them. The original function of the retriever in the name, the soft mouth developed for returning waterfowl intact. He sat with this for a moment. Then he went back to his section of the file and I saw him, from across the corridor, begin typing with the focused expression of someone who had just received information that reorganized a framework. Day 26 was when I found the additional file. I had been given access to the shared observational log for my own records, and I was in it to check my duty rotation notes when I saw a second file nested inside the main folder. It was named, in Varessi notation that translated roughly as Companion Species Behavioral Matrix, Implications for Interspecies Transit Protocols, Original Draft. It was 31 pages. I read it. It was not, as I had perhaps expected, simply an expanded version of Oran's nomenclature list. It was, and I want to be precise about this, because the precision is the point, a proposed revision to the Varessi Transit Authority's guidelines, multi-species crew assignments. It cited the 6-week observation period as a case study. It argued Sath's data on arousal cycles and Denek's retrieval path analysis and Orev's object assessment documentation and Oren's feeding ritual data, that Earth companion animals in transit environments functioned as what the draft called ambient threat calibrators, that the presence of a calm, Earth domesticated animal in a crew environment, provided a continuously updated behavioral baseline against which other crew members unconsciously regulated their own stress responses. The argument was, in essence, that Holt made the ship run better, not because he was useful in a task sense, because he contributed to any operational function, but because a Labrador who ate at 600 and walked in the cargo hold and fetched a ball for 18 repetitions and then lay down and went to sleep was, by the standard of every biological threat detection system aboard the ship, a continuous signal that nothing in the environment required a threat response. He was 4 years old and food-motivated and largely indifferent to the complexities of interspecies transit. And he had been, apparently, providing the Varessi crew with the daily reassurance that the world was not ending. I sat with this for a while. I thought about the Sorvini transport on the second run and the first mate whose foot Holt had sat on for 40 minutes while she processed manifests. I thought about whether she had felt calmer by the end of those 40 minutes. And I thought that she probably had, and that she had probably attributed it to something else. On day 30, I asked Oran directly what the document was for. He said, "It is a recommendation to the Transit Authority regarding crew animal protocols." He paused. "Currently, there are no formal protocols. Animals are handled under the general biological organism provisions which are functional but not specific." Another pause. "We believe they should be specific." I said, "You're writing a regulation." He said, "A recommendation. The regulation process is separate." I said, "Based on watching Holt eat kibble for a month." He said, "Based on watching Holt perform a complete behavioral cycle, threat assessment, environmental calibration, arousal management, proximity bonding, over 30 consecutive days in a closed transit environment, the kibble is incidental." He considered this. Although the supplement protocol section is thorough, on day 34, Denek asked if she could feed Holt. I said she could try, but that he had opinions about who handled the bowl and that she should be prepared for possibility that he would wait for me. She said she understood. She asked what word I said before he ate. I said, "Okay." She said she would use the same word. She fed him. She measured the kibble into the bowl with careful attention to the proportion, set the bowl at 63 centimeters from the starboard wall, said "okay" in her best approximation of my tone, and Holt ate. He ate the same way he always ate, methodical, focused, with the same 2 bowl licks at the end. Denek stood watching him finish. She had the expression of someone who had successfully completed a procedure, found the completion meaningful beyond its technical content. She said, "He knew I was going to say it." I said, "He knew what was coming before you got to the bowl." She said, "He reads the sequence." I said, "He reads everything." She looked at the bowl. Then she said, "At home, I grew up in a second-ring settlement, industrial sector. We had these animals that came to the ship docks to find food. Small ones, fast with sharp faces. We were afraid of them when we were children. We thought they were predators." She paused. "They were just scavengers. They were never interested in us. They were interested in the food. But we were afraid of them anyway." I didn't say anything, she said. "Holt is not afraid of anything," I said. "He's afraid of some things. Thunder. The vacuum attachment on the cleaning unit." She looked at me. I said, "It makes a loud noise and he doesn't like it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, "Just the loud noise." I said yes. Day 38, and I woke up at 0558 to find Holt sitting beside the bowl waiting. This was standard. He always woke before me. He always sat beside the bowl and waited. He had done this for 4 years, and he did it with the patient certainty of an animal that had learned, the deepest possible level, that the sequence always resolved in his favor. Not because he had power over the sequence, not because he had negotiated it, simply because the sequence had never failed him. The bowl had always been filled. I had always said okay. He had always eaten. He did not fidget. He did not pace. He sat, and he looked at the bowl, and occasionally he looked at me to confirm I was awake and the process was underway. And then he looked back at the bowl. The waiting was not anxious. It was simply waiting. The specific quality of waiting that belongs to something that does not doubt the outcome, only the timing. It occurred to me, sitting on the edge of my bunk, watching him watch the bowl, that this was probably the most complete form of trust I had ever observed in any living thing. Not blind trust. He knew the bowl, he knew me, he knew the ritual in complete detail. But trust that was so fully integrated into his understanding of how the world worked that it had become indistinguishable from certainty. The bowl would be filled. The word would be said. The day would proceed in its proper sequence. I'd been doing this for 4 years without understanding how strange it was. I measured the kibble. I set the bowl down. I said okay. He ate. We docked at Mars Station on day 42, which was a day ahead of the scheduled arrival, because the transit had been clean and Oran ran a tight schedule, and the tight schedule had produced, for the first time in the route's history, an early arrival that the station docking authority initially read as a reporting error. I was on the bridge for docking, which was standard for the crew liaison, and I watched the station approach through the forward screen. A Varessi standard installation with the angular aesthetic they favored, all clean function and no ornament, rotating slowly in the dayside light of its primary. Mars Station. End of the run. Oran came to find me when the docking clamp secured. He had the datapad. He also had a second item, a bound document, physical, which the Varessi used for materials they considered archival. The binding was a deep blue-gray, which in Varessi document culture indicated a completed record as opposed to a working file. On the cover, in Varessi notation, was the title. I asked him to translate it. He said, "Delight of the Companion, Observations on the Complete Behavioral Cycle of a Terran Retrieval Animal in Extended Transit with Notes on Applications to Multi-Species Crew Protocol." I took the document. It was 44 pages. The binding was tight and professional. On the inside front cover in Varessi notation that Oran translated when I asked was a dedication to Holt, primary observational subject, whose patience with our methodology was complete and whose methodology continues to instruct us. I read that twice. Oran said, "The working group voted on the dedication on day 39. I said, "Holt has a dedication." He said, "He was the primary observational subject." We went down the loading ramp together. Oran, Denik, Sath, Orav, and me. Holt on the leash beside me. The station dock was a Varessi transit hub, busy with the particular organized efficiency that Varessi transit hubs ran on, and the dock crew were processing the Orath Vayan's manifest and running their arrival checks. One of the station officers, a senior inspector by her rank markings, came to the ramp to meet us. She began the arrival protocol, and then she saw Holt and she stopped. He sat. He sat in the particular way he sat in new spaces, which was with his weight settled, and his ears forward and his eyes moving calmly across the environment, left, right, back to the inspector, then to the dock, then back to the inspector. His tail moved once. He was not alarmed. He was assessing. He looked as he always looked in new environments, like someone who had already decided the situation was manageable and was simply completing the evaluation for completeness' sake. The inspector looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Oren. Oren said, "The companion animal documentation is in order. The behavioral record is attached to the transit manifest." He held up the datapad. "We will also be submitting a separate recommendation to the transit authority regarding crew animal protocols. The submission will include the full case study." She looked at Holt again, then she looked at me. I said, "He's friendly." She looked at him for another moment. Then she completed the arrival protocol, marked the manifest cleared, and moved on. We walked off the ramp. The dock crew parted for us. Not dramatically, not with any sign that they were aware they were doing it. They moved to the sides of the ramp and left a clear path, and I noticed this because Oren noticed it and made a note on his datapad. I asked what he wrote down. He said, "Ambient behavioral effect on non-briefed personnel. Section 4 of the recommendations." I said, "They just moved out of the way." He said, "Yes." I thought about this as we walked through the dock and toward the station's transit corridor. I thought about Section 4 of the recommendations, and about the 31-page draft that was now 44 pages, and about the working group that had spent 6 weeks cataloging the behavior of a Labrador on a cargo run and what any of it meant. Holt pulled left. He had found a food cart near the transit corridor entrance. One of the Varessi standard provision carts that station docks ran for crews in transit, the small heating units, and the lidded containers. He could smell it from 8 meters away. His pull was purposeful and polite, pull of a dog who has detected something worth investigating and sees no reason to be subtle about his interest. I let him lead me to it. The cart operator, a young Varessi in station livery, looked down at him. Holt sat. He looked up at the cart with the specific expression of a Labrador communicating that he was aware there was food present and that he was prepared. "Wait." The cart operator looked at me. I said, "He's hoping." The cart operator reached under the counter, produced a small, dry biscuit from somewhere. The Varessi were nothing if not thorough in their supply management, and apparently someone had anticipated this possibility and held it out. Holt took it gently. He ate it in 2 bites. He looked up at the cart for a moment, assessed the situation, concluded there was probably not more, and looked back at me with the settled expression of a dog who has completed a transaction and is ready to proceed. The doctrine in my kit bag, and we walked on. The station corridor opened ahead of us, busy and ordinary, full of Varessi transit workers and cargo crews, and the general purposeful movement of a working dock. Holt walked beside me at the standard heel, close enough to feel his shoulder against my leg, which was the way he walked in new spaces. Not because I'd told him to stay close, because close was his preference. Behind me, I heard Oren say something to Denik in Varessi. I didn't ask for a translation. The far end of the dock, through the station's transit windows, the dayside primary burned clean and steady over the hull. Station turned slowly in it, the same as it had been turning before we arrived, the same as it would turn after we shipped out. Holt pulled slightly toward the window. I stopped. He stood beside me and looked out at the light. His tail moved. He was not thinking about the doctrine or the working group or Section 4 of the recommendations. He was not thinking about 44 pages of behavioral data, or arousal cycles, or the fetch protocol, or the precise placement of a kibble bowl. He was looking at the light. After a moment he looked up at me, and I looked down at him, and he had the expression he always had at the end of a run, the settled, unhurried look of an animal who knew where we were going next and trusted the sequence completely. I put my hand on his head. He leaned into it. Behind us, through the dock glass, the Orith Vane sat in its berth with the quiet solidity of a ship that had completed its run. 11 crew, 2 days, 44 pages. 1 bowl at 63 centimeters from the starboard wall. We walked on.